Welcome to Macroeconomics, a discussion of the federal budget. This discussion will happen in two parts. The first part is sort of the technical aspects, the basic shape of the budget. The size of the budget will be discussed. In part two, we'll look at more of the big picture philosophy, how this fits in with economic policy, how do we think about the size of the budget, is it in danger of bankrupting the U.S., etc. So this is a recent picture of the size of the public debt as a percent of our GDP. So just a sort of background context on what's happening. Of course, the shaded areas are recessions, as you know, and you can see in the most recent recession, the financial crisis, the federal budget took a nosedive in terms of deficit, borrowing, and the federal government spent a lot more, even as taxes were on the decline, as incomes were falling. And this is on purpose. This is part of fiscal policy. This is part of the Keynesian idea of spending against the direction of the economy to stabilize it. This is a little bit older view of what's going on with the different parts of the federal budget. The largest sources of revenue, as you can see, individual income tax is the big chunk there. So a lot of people misunderstand the income tax. The individual income tax in the U.S. is a progressive income tax, meaning that as your income rises, your marginal tax rate rises. So people with higher incomes will generally pay more of their income in taxes, although it doesn't work exactly how people think. For instance, if your marginal tax rate is 10%, that will be the rate you pay on an extra $100. It is not what you pay on every single dollar of your income, because what happens is we have different brackets. So lower incomes are taxed at lower tax brackets, lower rates. Higher incomes are taxed at higher rates. Only the portion of your income that falls into the higher rate will be taxed at that higher rate. So the marginal tax rate is different than the average tax rate. The average tax rate does rise in general as people's income rises, because we have increases in the marginal rate. But you can see the stair step in the blue line there, those are the different brackets. For instance, if you happen to make $16,750 and you earn one more dollar, that one more dollar will be taxed at 15%, but anything below $16,700 will be taxed at the lower 10% rate. So on average, people that have higher incomes do pay more in tax, but if you fall into the 35% tax bracket, you are not paying on average 35% of your income to taxes. So let's look at an example. So your average tax rate is the total tax payment divided by your total income. So if you've got $50,000 worth of income, which is not too far off the average American income, and you owe a total tax of $7,500, your average tax rate is just $7,500 divided by 50K, or 15%. So the government sets the marginal tax rate, and the average tax is sort of the residual, what we figure out after the fact. So here's an example question, if you'd like to pause and work it out. The answer is B, 19.8%. A few minor points on the income tax. There are things called exemptions. Not all of your income is taxed. Exemptions will reduce taxable income for spouse, dependents, etc. Deductions also reduce your taxable income. Specific expenses that you have out of your income are considered deduction. The huge one for America is the mortgage interest deduction. And unlike other countries, we really encourage with our policy people to buy homes rather than rent. And some have wondered if the financial crisis which sort of started with the bursting of the real estate bubble, was maybe in part due to this mortgage interest deduction encouraging more people than otherwise would to buy homes. Another thing about taxes, our business taxes tend to be pretty high. So 35% corporate income tax, one of the highest in the world. And it encourages tax avoidance. The higher the tax rate in general for anybody, the more incentive there is to avoid taxes. And there have been some well-publicized instances of companies very aggressively moving their profits and their income sources offshore, setting up subsidiaries in different countries like Ireland or other low-tax nations in order to sort of game the system and avoid U.S. tax. So many economists have called for lower corporate income tax for various reasons, and that is one of them. And in the end, who pays a corporate income tax? There will be others besides just the corporation that pay. So overall, we can say the U.S. tax code is slightly progressive, meaning the tax rate rises as income rises. Some have argued for a flat tax. This is highly controversial because there are some deliberate policy advantages of a progressive tax. Regressive tax, an example would be sales tax. Effectively, although not deliberately, people with higher incomes tend to pay a lower tax rate. And with the sales tax, it's simply because people with higher incomes tend to spend less of their income as a percent. So less of their income is subject to the tax. Poorer people will spend most of their income, and so will be more of their dollars of income are subject to tax. So they pay effectively more of their income to the sales tax. One more question to ask is, where does our tax money go? So here is a look at, in general, where a lot of our federal budget is spent. You can pause here to take a look at this. And here's fiscal year 2014, snapshot that I just pulled off the internet, and you can see the big chunks here are defense, healthcare, pensions, that includes Social Security. Those are by far the largest chunks. A few words about Social Security. Social Security is the single largest government program in the world. It's run on a pay-as-you-go basis, meaning the current contributions pay for the current recipients. So current workers and taxpayers are funding the people that currently draw from the Social Security benefits. And that is because, of course, the first year that you start Social Security, 1940, the recipients need to be funded somehow, and that is they are funded by the current payees. There's been a lot of debate about Social Security. Is it sustainable, especially given the fact that people are living much longer than they did when Social Security was instituted? Medicare and Medicaid, these are terms that are important to know. I'm skipping a lot of the terms, obviously, because those are easy for you just to read in the text, but Medicare and Medicaid are important ones. Medicare is for the elderly, and Medicaid is government spending for the poor. It's worth noting that there are some common misperceptions. For instance, that welfare, unemployment insurance take up a large chunk of the federal budget. They simply do not. The massive programs, as we've seen before, are defense, healthcare, and pensions, including Social Security. So it's about 9% of the federal budget that goes to these kind of programs. Welfare programs are the most important ones are TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, which underwent a big change in the 90s, in the Clinton years. welfare overhaul. Basically, some pretty stringent limits were put on welfare. You can only draw for a much shorter amount of time than you were able to before, and there's requirements to go to work, etc. And the earned income tax credit, and that is sort of a reverse tax for low incomes. So that's about the long and the short of the federal budget as far as the basic shape and technical aspects of taxes. Earmarks, you may hear that term, and those are important, although not the largest share of inefficiency in the government budget. So we'll turn our attention now to the debt. So this is the end of the first of the two tutorials for this section.